Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Designing Surveys for Your Volunteer Program. The target audience for this session is VISTA members serving in organizations that have volunteer programs. But regardless of your role within your VISTA project, we're very glad to have you here today. And we know that these skills can and will be helpful moving forward in your careers. My name is Stephen Bronskill. I'm a training specialist for AmeriCorps Vista. I'm an AmeriCorps alum, and I'll be your host for today's webinar. You'll also see my colleague in the Vista training unit, Chris Hawks, who's monitoring the chat and the Q&A throughout the presentation. And I'm so lucky today to be joined by Libby Bray with Education Northwest. Welcome, Libby.
Thank you so much, Stephen. I'll share a little bit about myself. I have 15 years of experience designing studies and conducting mixed methods research, and I have a PhD in developmental psychology. So I've been trained in survey design and analysis, and I've also been trained in culturally responsive and equitable evaluation approaches. So really what that means is that in my work, I partner with educational organizations like schools, districts, after-school programs, nonprofits, and community colleges to improve their services through gathering and analyzing data. And my favorite projects are really those where I get to work closely with partners at these organizations to develop their own data collection tools like surveys and build their capacity to use data to guide their own program planning and evaluation. So I'm really excited to share some of what I've learned through these projects with you all today. So we're going to cover quite a bit of information today that will help you design surveys to support volunteers at your VISTA project. First, we'll walk through how to create surveys that give you data that you can really use. We'll then explore how and when to use different types of survey questions. And then we'll also discuss some best practices to use for survey design and administration. And then we'll finish our time together today with a Q&A session, and we'll also share some tools that you can use in your VISTA service. So we'll start by sharing a little bit about what a survey is. You might be pretty familiar with surveys. It's a systematic way to gather information from a group of people. And so it's a process that involves asking people purposefully designed questions to gather information on their opinions, behaviors, experiences, characteristics, availability, and anything else you might want to know. Surveys can be a really helpful tool as you manage and support volunteers at your VISTA project. And by collecting high quality information from volunteers, you can better understand their skills, interests, availability, and needs, and refine your program to better support them. So the first step in designing a survey is really thinking about how you want to use the information that you collect. What is your goal for the survey? So thinking about your goal for the survey will help you narrow down what questions you want to include. So let's explore the different kinds of information that you might want to gather and how to do it. As we talk through these, think about why you joined this webinar. What information are you interested in gathering from the volunteers at your organization? So you might want to assess or understand the skills of your potential volunteers. You could develop a survey that uses task-based scenarios or self-assessment questions, and this could help you strategically match volunteers with roles that maximize their talents and benefit the organization. You might also want to gather feedback or evaluate the effectiveness of your volunteer programs. So you might design a survey that includes rating scales or do a pre-post design where you collect information before and after they participate in a program. This would allow you to measure changes or improvements over time and can provide valuable insights for program development. We'll go more in depth about designing rating scales later in this webinar. If you need to identify gaps or concerns within your volunteer program, you might use the survey as a tool for needs sensing. So this might include open-ended questions around key topics to highlight areas that require attention or improvement. And then you could use this information to refine the program or services and ensure a supportive environment for your volunteers. You will likely use a survey to gather information about your volunteers. So this might include demographic information, other characteristics, interests, availability, and this will really help you understand who your volunteers are, which is a key to creating a more inclusive and engaging volunteer community within your organization. And then you can also think about surveys as a way to track participation data. So if you're ever using registration forms or exit tickets, these are a form of a survey. And this can really help you understand trends in volunteer engagement and also how you might improve engagement or retention strategies.
All right. Thank you so much, Libby. We want to hear from you from exactly what Libby just shared. Would love you to take a moment to brainstorm about the types of information you would like to gather from surveys at your Vista project. So I'd encourage you to share in the chat, what types of information are you hoping to gather from volunteers at your organization? Take a moment, think about it, share, and I'll pass it to Libby as these comments come in to chat about it. Thanks so much, y'all.
Great, thank you so much. Yeah, I'm seeing some responses come in. It looks like using surveys to gather feedback about whether they feel like the work is meaningful or their experience with volunteering, barriers that they face when volunteering. A survey could be a great way to gather that. I'm seeing some responses about skills assessment or understanding how they learned about it, demographic information. Yeah, how to maximize positive experiences. Oh, interesting. Surveying alumni. So getting feedback for people that maybe are no longer volunteering. That's a great way to understand your program. What motivated them to become a volunteer? Oh yeah, the expectations for volunteering. So making sure that what you're have planned for them aligns maybe with what they're expecting. Knowledge or skills. There's ways to improve their experiences or their onboarding. What they hope to gain. So making sure that they can get the most out of their volunteering experience. Wonderful. Well, thank you all so much for participating in this chat question, and feel free to keep chiming in if other ideas pop up for you. So I saw some great examples of the kinds of information that you might wish to collect from volunteers in the chat. And so some of the ideas as we were planning for this webinar that we were thinking about were transportation needs. So if your program offers transportation assistance or has volunteers that are willing to carpool, you could help volunteers with transportation needs by understanding what those are through a survey. And this could help cut down on transportation time. You might also want to gather information about their location, or the locations that they prefer to volunteer. And this could also help decrease the time they need to commute, which could increase their satisfaction and retention. We heard a lot of people chiming in that they would use a survey to understand availability. As you know, scheduling volunteers in different time slots can be a challenging puzzle. And so using a survey to understand availability, especially if you can export and organize the survey data, can really help you kind of streamline that process and maximize the best fit for volunteers. And then we also heard a lot of people talking about volunteering goals, volunteering expectations, what they hope to gain, why they wanted to be a volunteer. And this can really help you tailor future opportunities and marketing to connect with potential volunteers and make sure that the volunteers in your program have an experience that meets their expectations, that helps them achieve their goals. You might also think about using surveys to collect information like work preferences, t-shirt sizes, allergies, or any other accessibility needs that would help you better support volunteers. So we've talked about some of the ways that you might use the information gathered from a survey. Now we're going to dive into writing survey questions. And there are a variety of different ways that you can design survey questions to get the information that you need. The types of questions that you use will really depend on the kind of information that you're trying to collect from volunteers. And when you're designing a survey, you'll typically use a mix of closed-ended questions and open-ended questions. So closed-ended questions are questions where you provide participants with response options. So think about like a multiple choice a checklist or a rating scale. And then an open-ended question is when you ask participants to generate their own responses. So it might be something where they would write in a response. So we're going to talk through each of these question types and when they might use them. And we'll start with close-ended questions. So the first close-ended question that we're going to talk about is a rating scale or a Likert scale. In a Likert scale question, participants rate their response from high to low on a particular item. These are typically designed with 5 choices so that there's a neutral response option in the middle. And you'll want to make sure that you balance the response options so that the midpoint truly is neutral and the ends are equally positive or negative. A common way to frame these questions is around levels of agreement, as you see on the left here, or around levels of satisfaction, as you see on the right. If you have a series of Likert questions, you could create a grid or matrix question, and that way the response options are the same across all of them. So across the top here, you'll see it goes from strongly agree, agree, neither agree nor disagree, disagree, and then strongly disagree. And those response options are the same for all of the different items on the left. So this is a question that's seeking to understand volunteers' goals for volunteering. And by setting up the question in this format, it means that they don't have to process the response options separately for each question. I made this survey with Google Forms, which is free to use. So feel free to check it out as a tool when you're drafting surveys. The other way that you can understand levels of agreement or disagreement is with a slider question. So you're probably familiar with this type of question from social media. It's a common way to build interaction into a post. And the same principle can be used in a survey for your volunteer program. So you could use a slider to understand the level of which someone agrees or disagrees with a statement or an idea. And you can really just use these like a rating or a Likert scale. An advantage to slider questions is that they might be more engaging or intuitive, especially if you have volunteers that are familiar and use them in social media. I will say the data can be a little more challenging to analyze, and sometimes you would want to include like a not applicable or an I don't know response option, which is hard to do with a slider. The other challenge with sliders is that it can be hard for someone taking a survey to know if they've answered or not, and they might just leave the slider at the bottom and then you are missing data for that. So just some things to think through as you're deciding between sliders versus rating scales.
Thanks, Libby, and great job, everybody. Again, shared some really great things that you're collecting through surveys. Want to hear from you again. When do you think you'd use one of these slider scale questions in your service? So again, some really good examples from the chat. Would love to hear some more of when you might use this at your Vista project. And if you have any questions about it. So again, I'll pass back to Libby as these responses come in. They're looking great already.
Thank you so much. Yes, I'm seeing measuring satisfaction, self-assessment. It could be a way to have volunteers rate their own skill level for a particular skill, giving feedback after an event or an exit survey, asking how likely they are to volunteer again or how satisfied they are with their volunteer experience or training. Levels of understanding with a particular training or content area. Getting feedback about new programs. Oh yeah, asking them about how prepared they feel. Great. Well, thank you all so much for participating in this chat question. I'm hearing a lot of responses about gathering feedback, understanding how they would rate their own knowledge or skills, their satisfaction with the volunteer experience, and their feedback about training materials or onboarding. So thank you so much. And one thing to keep in mind with these kinds of feedback type questions is how that they can respond anonymously to make sure that responses are authentic. So another type of close-ended question is a multiple choice question. You're probably familiar with these. They would select one response from the response options that you provide. And so the question on screen here is asking, how long have you been volunteering with us? And the options are less than 3 months, 4 to 6 months, 7 to 12 months, and more than 12 months. One thing to keep in mind when you're drafting multiple choice questions is that the response options should be mutually exclusive. So you wouldn't want to say less than 3 months and then have the next one be 3 to 6 months, because for someone that's been volunteering for 3 months, they wouldn't know where to respond. And then also that they should be comprehensive. So this one includes an option of less than 3 months, which could go all the way to someone that started today, and more than 12 months if you have someone that's been with you for 10 years. It allows anyone to find their response option available. Checkbox questions are similar to multiple choice, but in this case, participants can select more than one responses. As with the multiple choice, you want to make sure that the responses do not overlap and that they're comprehensive. But in this case, you would have participants, for example, select all that apply question. And then ranking questions are another type of close-ended question. And this can be really helpful when you're trying to understand volunteers' preferences. So this question on the screen is seeking to understand volunteers' schedule preferences, and it's asking them to rank the days of the week in order of the preference for when they would like to volunteer. I used a program in Microsoft Office to create this question, and so it's free to anyone that has a Microsoft Office subscription. And so we're going to share the link to this tool and others to help you develop surveys. So there are some questions that you're going to want to include to find out information about the people taking the survey. Even if your goal of the survey is simply to gather feedback or to understand skill assessment, you'll still probably want to understand who it is that's taking the survey. And so demographic questions or other kind of questions can help you understand who the survey respondents and who your volunteers are. And although this seems straightforward, there are a variety of considerations to keep in mind when you're collecting demographic information. First, you'll want to make sure that your response options are inclusive and always try and provide write-in options so that someone that doesn't see something that applies to them can write in their own response. You'll also want to look really carefully at these questions to think about anything that could be sensitive or identifying and really only ask what you need to know. You can also consider making demographic questions optional or really thinking carefully about which questions you might need to require. And if you're not sure if a demographic question is sensitive, you can gather feedback on the questions and response options from people at your organization or volunteers, and they might be able to help you kind of assess the sensitivity of a particular question. We typically recommend including these questions at the end after they've offered their feedback or indicated their preferences or whatever the main body of the survey was designed to do. And that way it doesn't affect their responses. There are a variety of resources available to help you design really thoughtful and sensitive demographic questions. And so we're linking some of those in the chat here. And then finally, open-ended questions. These are questions where participants write in their own responses and can give you really good, nuanced, detailed information about whatever it is that you want to know. But you need to be really strategic with open-ended questions. Typically, you'll only want to include one or two, and these can be used to kind of provide nuance or answer questions that can't be answered by a closed-ended question. So you might use these types of questions when sending out a survey during volunteering or after volunteering, asking for recommendations or asking why they chose to volunteer, but think carefully about really only your top one or two open-ended questions that you might have. As you're deciding what questions to include, consider how you're going to analyze the responses. This will help you craft the right questions. And then finally, consider inclusion and accessibility. Make sure that all of your survey respondents will be able to fully engage with an open-ended question. All right, so we've thought through a variety of question types that we can use to gather information. And now I'll turn it over to Stephen to launch a poll.
Yeah, thanks so much, Libby. This has been so helpful. So we are going to launch kind of a cool poll. There are going to be 4 questions appearing on your screen, and you're going to try to match those to the 4 survey questions that Libby just walked us through. So you have to match them up, take your best guess. We totally understand if you're in the middle of something right now and maybe not accessible for your screen, it's totally okay. You can also just think through this. The different questions here about from what is your t-shirt size to rate the effectiveness of a training, how can we make trainings better? Take a moment, give you some space here to fill this out, and I'll have Libby talk through the answers in just a moment. Great job, everybody. We're gonna keep this open for a few more seconds, so get those answers in, but we're gonna then share out the results of this and gonna turn this over to Libby to explain, what the best option might be for each of these. I really appreciate everybody sharing here. Great job.
All right, thank you all so much. So the first question on my screen, A, please rate the effectiveness of the training you received. So a great question type for this would be a rating scale or a Likert scale. So you could rate it from very effective to very ineffective, or you could rate their agreement with a statement like, this training was really effective. That would be a great way to gather that kind of feedback. The second item here was how to make the volunteer experience better. And an open-ended question is going to work really well here for participants to generate their own recommendations and ideas for how you could improve the volunteer experience. All right, the third one is, what is your t-shirt size? And multiple choice is probably going to be your best option here. You really only want someone selecting one size. If you're getting one t-shirt for each volunteer, you don't want them selecting multiple sizes. That could be confusing. And then the last one is, what training or information would help you be more effective? Select all that apply. And here you might use a checkbox because you really want to hear all of the different kinds of information or training options that your volunteers are looking for. All right, so hopefully this helps kind of show how you might use different question formats to get at the different kinds of information that you're looking for. And so now we're going to talk through some best practices in writing questions. All right, so the first recommendation here is to think about how to get reliable and accurate information that meets your goals. Leading questions are questions that are written in a way that might influence the respondent or include a value judgment. And so instead, you'll want to consider how to be as neutral as possible. A leading question might be something like, how does this organization make you feel like you belong? And so that really kind of assumes that the organization has made volunteers feel like they belong. So you might consider a more neutral question like, do you feel like you belong? If so, why? If not, why not? Something that allows them to kind of land on both sides of it. Double-barreled questions are questions that ask multiple things in the same question. And so to gather more accurate data, you'll want to make sure that each question is asking about only one thing. An example of a double-barreled question is something like, how satisfied are you with the volunteer experience and hours? Instead, you'd want to separate this into separate questions about the volunteer experience and the hours. Another thing to avoid is using language or terms that might have multiple interpretations. This can impact the accuracy of your data if the questions can be interpreted in different ways. So instead of using unclear terminology or terms that are up to interpretation, think about how you can simplify language or define your terms. So something like acronyms, jargon, or references that might be meaningful, like how would you rate the event last weekend, might be really unclear to someone taking the survey. And then after drafting your survey questions, check them ideally with other people to make sure that you haven't made any assumptions that would impact the survey responses or analysis. So for example, a question like, why are you choosing to remain a volunteer, assumes that they are choosing to remain a volunteer. And so thinking about more inclusive wording that would allow them to indicate if they plan to continue volunteering, and then using an open response question to ask them why or why not.
All right. Thank you so much, Libby. So just want to check in with everybody about how these surveys practices might show up in your Vista service. We've got a scenario up on the screen. And in this one, our goal is to learn about positive experiences as well as areas to grow for volunteers. So the question on this survey is open-ended and asks volunteers to share, what did you enjoy about your volunteer experience and what would you like to change? A poll is going to launch on your screen. Want to encourage you to select something that would improve this survey question. So we'll give you a moment here to decide. You could change this to a multiple choice question, change this to a double barreled question, change this to true or false, or change this to a Likert scale matrix question. We'll give you a second to answer here and we'll come on back. Doing a great job. Give you a few more seconds here to answer. I appreciate everybody participating and thinking through this. How would you improve this survey question? All right, excellent work. I hope this question is something that you're thinking about at your site. I think it matches some of what was shared in the chat earlier today. We will close this poll here so that you can see the result. And it looks like folks did a really nice job. So vast majority of members selected the correct answer, which was B, and no worries if you said something else, that's okay. But I'll note that changing this to a double barrel question into two open-ended questions will allow volunteers to share more meaningful feedback that could help your Vista project. So thanks again for participating. Libby's got some more good stuff for you coming up.
All right, so we've talked through some different survey question types and best practices in drafting those. Now we're going to think about some best practices for putting together the survey altogether. So at the start of a survey, you're going to want to make sure to provide information about the goals of the survey, a time estimate for how long it will take to complete, and information about who will have access to the data and how it will be used. You'll also want to define any words that might be up to interpretation or keywords that they would need to understand, and spell out any acronyms. You can place this information at the top of the survey or weave it into the questions, whatever makes the most sense for you. When you're thinking about organizing surveys, keep it short. So it's a common tendency to try and gather as much information from folks as possible when we're putting together surveys. But you really will get the best data if you keep it short so that respondents can stay engaged the whole time. You can use this opportunity to gather feedback and input from others. And then you'll want to pay attention to the flow of the survey. So we talked about putting open-ended questions at the end, or grouping demographic questions and putting them at the end. And then overall, think about what information you'd like to require and what questions could be optional. A common practice, as I said, is to make some of the demographic questions optional. Sometimes people also make open-ended questions optional so that participants complete the rest of the survey if they don't have time to really type in a detailed response. And then think about how you can be as transparent as possible with your survey. You want to Be really clear with survey respondents about what is and what's not possible. So for example, if you're asking volunteers about their preferred time slot, be really clear about whether you're using this information to match them up with a specific time slot or just trying to kind of gather a general understanding about volunteers' preferences for different time slots. So you really want to make sure that people understand how the data will be used and what outcomes they should expect from providing their input. And then we have a series of recommendations to make your surveys accessible for everyone. When thinking about the language you use in your survey, think about what language your volunteers are going to be most comfortable taking the survey in. You can use a translator to offer the survey in other languages. Some survey programs have built-in translation, although I recommend having a translator check those translations to make sure that they're actually high quality. And then also think about the level of the language you're using. Remember that the average reading level for adults in the United States is a 7th grade reading level. And so there's online tools that you can use to check the readability of your survey, and these are in the chat. To make the reading level closer to 7th grade, you'll want to use short sentences and short words and really clear word choice so that the survey directions and questions are easily understood. Another aspect to consider is the format that you're offering the survey. Some people are going to prefer to kind of the anonymity of taking a survey online, but others might prefer to have a conversation with you or provide their responses in an email. So think about whether you are able to offer some of these other ways to gather feedback or understand preferences or skill level. And then finally, if you are doing an online survey, always check to make sure that it's mobile friendly. A lot of people will likely be taking the survey on their phone. So make sure that the questions and the response options still make sense and show up okay on a mobile format. You also want to think about visual accessibility, and there's a variety of recommendations around visual accessibility, and these will be shared in the resources later on. So you want to avoid using images or videos, and then grid questions can also affect the visual accessibility. They can be difficult to navigate and difficult for screen readers to describe. You'll typically want to use a font size of 14 or larger. And then if you have required questions, use something like an asterisk or another symbol instead of changing the font color. Okay, so you have now put together a beautiful survey. You've thought carefully about your questions. You have thought about the flow. You have a mix of closed-ended and open-ended questions. You've thought about visual accessibility and language. Now we're going to talk through some of the best practices to consider when you're actually ready to launch your survey and send it out to your volunteers. First, if possible, you'll want to pilot your survey, which means testing it out with a small group and gathering feedback. This can help you understand questions that might be misleading or confusing. It will tell you how long the survey takes. And you'll also get a sense for the kind of data that you're likely to get in the open-ended questions, and make sure that you're really gathering the kinds of responses that are going to be most helpful to you. There's typically 2 ways to administer surveys. So you can send every participant an individual link, and this allows you to follow up with people that haven't completed the survey, but it does impact confidentiality because you know which link went to which person. You can also create one link for everyone to use, and this allows responses to be anonymous, but it can be really hard to keep track of who has completed the survey or not. And typically when you're following up to remind people to complete the survey, you're having to remind everyone, even those that already did the survey. Finally, it's really important to send out a thank you. You want to make sure that people that are giving you data and providing feedback and sharing information with you understand the value of their time and the information provided. This is also a great way to keep in touch with participants or volunteers. I saw some of you talking about using this as a way to reach out to alumni. So this can be kind of a great engagement technique to really keep in touch with people even after they've left the program. All right, now we're briefly going to discuss some best practices to consider when analyzing your survey. There's a lot more to learn about data analysis, of course, but we'll just identify a few kind of key recommendations as you're thinking about analysis. First, think about analysis when you're first designing the survey. Think about whether you want to convert your responses to numbers. For example, a Likert scale, you might want to look at averages. Or if you're thinking about demographic data, you might want to look at percentages. With open responses, you might be looking for quotes or themes. And so you're going to want to think about how you might use that data as you develop the survey questions. And then make sure that the data justifies any conclusions that you're drawing. So if you have 20 volunteers, but you hear back from 5 of them that they really like the training, does that mean that the training was really successful? Really kind of think critically about whether you can draw a strong conclusion from a sample that isn't a large portion of your volunteer group or representative. You can also reflect your findings back to the participants and see if they resonate, or see if the people that took the survey have a different additional insights or interpretations of the findings.
Thank you, Libby. Those are some great points that bring us to our summary. So today we've discussed how to create useful surveys for your volunteer program. We've explored when to use different types of survey questions. And finally, Libby shared with us some best practices from survey design. So we are going to put those pieces together with a review question. In this scenario, Jeremy is a VISTA member organizing volunteers at a food bank, which includes many types of roles. It includes fundraising, helping in the warehouse, community engagement, and Jeremy needs to assess which volunteers prefer which type of work and fill those spots accordingly. So which survey question would best help Jeremy fill these volunteer roles? We're going to launch one more poll here. Appreciate everyone's great work. Going to give you a moment to fill this out. Thanks so much. Great job, everybody. Going to give you a few more seconds to answer here. Thank you so much for your participation. Appreciate all your work today. I hope this is a scenario that might apply to your service as a VISTA member. Get that vote in. I am actually going to pass to Libby to, as we end the poll, to share the answer.
All right, so it looks like the group is split. The correct answer here is A. Jeremy could use a ranking question to understand volunteers' preferences and match them with the best roles. And a lot of people selected D, and a lot of you might have thought about D. And D would be another question to understand their willingness to participate in different roles, and you would get kind of a broad sense of anything that they might be interested in doing. But if you're really interested in understanding their preferences, what their top preference versus their second preference versus their third preference would be, in this case, a ranking question would be best. And so this really connects back to thinking about what is the purpose of the survey, what is the purpose of the question when you're designing a survey question.
Thanks, Libby, and thanks everybody again. I have seen some excellent responses in the Q&A and in the chat today. I want to share one more link with you, and this is a handout that has all the links that have been shared in our presentation today. These are some tools that Libby and our team recommend for further study. This has a great list of survey design best practices, ways to support equity in demographic questions, accessibility ideas, and even some example survey questions you might use in your service. So would encourage you to take a look at that in the chat. Thanks, Stephanie, for sharing the PDF as well. We will also email this to you and post on the Vista campus, but want to encourage you to take a moment and review this if it can help you at your service site. Shifting gears briefly, would love to know what you think about this webinar. Here is a survey in a survey webinar. So thanks so much for offering your feedback. This input really is invaluable to us, the Vista program. We review all this content, all your feedback to determine how can we improve this presentation. So thanks for taking a quick moment to complete this brief survey and for sharing your thoughts. I mentioned the Q&A, keep those coming. I had a couple of really good questions flagged, but please share more. We've got a little bit of time here together. Libby, thank you so much again for sharing your expertise with us today. I had a question from TK earlier about how can we best buy organizations into surveys? Maybe if an organization is a little bit skeptical, how can we help them see how beneficial these surveys can be in our Vista service?
Yeah, a great way to gain buy-in is through explaining how you're planning to use the data. Typically, you're using the data to improve the program, right? Or to make sure that volunteers have a better experience. And so if you can be really transparent and say, we want to ask for their feedback on this so that we can make it better, that's going to be a great way to gather buy-in. You can also share if you've done surveys in the past or used the data, kind of demonstrate how you've used the data to improve the program. And really kind of share with them how they're going to benefit through gathering data in a systematic way. I think sometimes people have a sense that they might know what the volunteers think or that they might know what the volunteers are hoping to get out of it. But a survey might open their eyes to things that they might not have been aware of. And so that can be another way to gather buy-in, is just through thinking about surveys as another tool to use to gather information that they might really want to have about their volunteers.
Thanks so much, Libby. Another good question from Jonathan. If you're ever using sensitive information through a survey, what type of ethics review board, maybe an IRB board, would a Vista member need to go to if you're dealing with sensitive information in a survey?
Yeah, that's a great question, and something that's really important to keep in mind. My guess is that it's going to be somewhat variable. Some organizations have their own IRB. For others, you could typically look to a university and talk to their IRB. You might not be able to go through their full IRB process, but you might be able to have them weigh in on the ethics or the sensitivity of the data that you're collecting. And then, typically you're going to want to really try not to ask really sensitive information if you can avoid it. For the kinds of the surveys that you would be hearing from volunteers that you work closely, think about kind of the trust component and make sure that they don't feel like like it could affect their relationship with you or the organization to respond to a survey. But I would encourage you to reach out to a university in your community or a college if you don't have an IRB at your organization.
Thanks, Libby. See a good question from Mandy. How can we increase response rates for surveys?
Well, the most common thing that you'll see is offering an incentive. And so there's a variety of ways that you could incentivize survey participation. You can do, a drawing for gift cards. Another way that I've seen that works really well when you're trying to survey people at an organization is to incentivize a certain percentage of response rates. So, if 75% of people respond, we'll have pizza for lunch. Something like that can work well to kind of get everyone to feel like they're part of a larger whole.
Awesome, Libby. I saw Kim with a comment of what's an IRB. Yeah, institutional review board may only apply to some projects. Thanks, Jeremy, for putting that definition in as well. I did want to ask you, Libby, as someone who's a real expert in this field, what advice do you have for Vista members just generally about using surveys and maximizing them through their service?
Yeah, I think the most important thing, and this connects back to what I said earlier about buy-in, is just being really transparent about how you're using the data and when you're using the data. So for example, if you hear from folks in a survey that they want a particular type of training, and then you work to provide that training, share with folks that you're providing that training based on what they said in the survey. So just make sure that people see the value of the information that they're sharing and how it's being used, and that will really kind of help create a culture where data and evidence is valued, and they see the value of that.
Libby, thank you so much. These have been some wonderful answers and some great advice throughout the presentation. I also really appreciate all the excellent questions from our members. Let's do this. I've got a couple more things to share, but if you have additional questions, put them in the Q&A. We would love to continue to answer those. We will stay on until those get answered today. I'm also going to put just our email in the chat. You got an email from us today with a reminder for this webinar, vistatraining@americorps.gov. If you're like me and you think of a great question for Libby an hour after this webinar, don't hesitate to pass it along. We always want to support you in your service with training opportunities for this topic and lots more. So please do not hesitate to reach out to us. And Libby, I'll pass to you if there's any final notes here before we wrap up, but I just want to thank you so much for joining us today.
Yes, thank you. No final notes, but thank you all so much. It was really great speaking with you all, and thank you so much for engagement in the chat. Don't hesitate to reach out if you have any other questions.
Yeah, thanks so much, Libby. So again, we'll keep responding to those in writing, but just a friendly reminder that we're going to post the recording and handout used today in the Vista campus later this week. And to log in, you'll need to go to the correct learning path, and I'll show you how to do that. Once you log into the Vista campus, you'll click catalog. You'll see the red square on the screen here. That's going to bring you to the learning paths available. This one is going to be posted under volunteer management. You'll see a bunch of other great stuff there too. You can search for this as well, filter by members. And once you're logged in and at the learning path, you'll enroll in it to join it. This takes just a couple of quick steps. Once you've joined that learning path, you can browse through the available recorded webinars at your leisure. And again, I want to say thank you for attending today. I hope you can join us for our next webinar. It's going to be called Preparing to Transition Out of Your Vista Project. No matter where you are in service, creating sustainability is a real core value at Vista. We would love to have you there. We are going to meet in the new year on Wednesday, January 24th, 2024. Happy early new year. And again, that webinar is going to be held at the same time from 3 to 4 p.m. Eastern. I appreciate Stephanie sharing the link to register for that in the chat. You can also see it on the Vista calendar on the Vista campus, and a blue or green dot is going to show up on the day. If you click on January 24th, you'll see the description and link to register for the webinar. And we really would love to see you there. On behalf of Libby, on behalf of Chris and all of us, the Vista training team, thank you so much for being here today. This concludes our presentation. Thank you for your service. Happy holidays. Best wishes to you and your family this time of year. This concludes our webinar, and we look forward to seeing you very soon. Thank you all.